ये रेडियो पाकिस्तान पॉडकास्ट है।
Dear listeners and viewers, today in Radio Pakistan studios, we have a distinguished historian, broadcaster, and friend of Mohtarma Benazir Bhutto, Shaheed, former Prime Minister of Pakistan. We welcome you to studios of Radio Pakistan, Victoria Schofield.
Thank you.
It is a pleasure, and also some clouds of our dark clouds of our history, they are also going to cover our atmosphere in this conversation. You and your friend Benazir Bhutto were together at Oxford during your student years from 1974 to 1977. Would you reflect upon those days, happy days, which in your book, which is the 32 years Friendships Mamair, The Fragrance of Tears, with Mohtarma Benazir Bhutto? We start our journey from Oxford. Can you reflect on those interactions, the early interactions with Benazir Bhutto?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak about Benazir Bhutto and my friendship. It's true, 1974 was a long time ago, and things were very different. The world was very different. And I think the overriding memory of those years was they were student days, they were years of some hard work, but they were also very carefree days. We were young, we were not particularly concerned about what the world events were at that time. We were involved with the student politics, and that's really how I became friendly with Benazir Bhutto, because we were both members of the Oxford Union Society. We were also incidentally both in the same college, Lady Margaret Hall, and so I encountered her not only in the Oxford Union but also in Lady Margaret Hall. But one of the great aspects of our friendship, I think, was our interest in the debates which were held in the Oxford Union, which did bring us into the outside world. We debated important topics. We had to be able to debate on either side of a motion, whether it depended on your viewpoint. You would have to learn up what the other viewpoint might be. And that was, I think, for me, it was my early training in terms of becoming a writer and a historian. And for Benazir, as we know, it was her early training in becoming a political leader. Although I should stress at the time, when she left Oxford in 1977, she actually thought she would go into Pakistan's foreign service.
In your memoir, you have mentioned Oxford years, and particularly that was the happiest period of your friendship as well as Benazir Bhutto's life, because after that the political tragedy begins. Those were the salad days which you have mentioned in your chapter. And would you share some of those experiences when you would go in your leisure time for the ice cream, or Benazir Bhutto would drive on the streets of Oxford, that small sports car?
Yes, she'd been gifted a small sports car by her parents for having graduated from Harvard, because one has to recall that she had also already obtained her degree from Harvard University. And I think initially when she came to Oxford, she missed her Harvard days, she missed her Harvard friends. But gradually, as she got into the Oxford student life, it was a little different. It was not America. Times were changing because, of course, she was at Harvard towards the late 60s. She actually first came to Oxford in 1973. She was 1 year in Oxford already before I came. She came to love Oxford, and she came to love her friends. And actually throughout her life, you're right, it was the happiest time, and she used to draw strength from those friendships and from those Oxford days, which were effectively, she wasn't to know it, but some of the happiest of her life, because very soon after she returned to Pakistan, in 1977, the military coup took place, and her father was overthrown. She'd already had a whisper of that, and I remember meeting her for tea one time after the March elections in 1977 when there were protests. And she looked a little more troubled than she normally did. And I think this was, if I look back on it now, this was the beginning of her journey in a way, because she was concerned at what might be happening. And of course, the fruition of her concern came on that 5th of July 1977, subsequently with her father's arrest on a charge of conspiracy to murder.
When Benazir Bhutto was the president of Student Union in Oxford, she used the green stationery, and the cover of the book almost it's splashed with the green color, and she used to dress in green. That was the color of Pakistan.
Yes.
And once your mother also gave her some gift, which was also in the color of Pakistan. How she was as a human being. We are not talking about as a politician. As a human being interacting with the people you have seen in the last 32 years in Pakistan and abroad.
Well, I think it's difficult to sum up a friendship in a few words because it's got so much depth. I think one of the initial first characters was that she was always very appreciative. She was always very kind, and she was very generous. But the appreciation came from the small things. And you're right, it was my mother who had brought her for her farewell debate a little bouquet of flowers which were white with green, because she also knew that the white and green, the colors of the Pakistani flag. And it was just a small gesture which my mother had made, but yet she appreciated it so much that it meant everything to my mother, and probably is one of the reasons why my mother didn't put up any obstacles when I decided to come to Pakistan in 1978. And there I remained during what was a very dark period. But it was that ability that she had to be gracious towards other people, even if she didn't know them particularly well. And I think that's what endeared her to so many people.
Oxford Union was a male-dominated body, and
it was
there
a
were
male-dominated body.
Women presidents before Benazir Bhutto, and after Benazir Bhutto, you became president of
yes.
Oxford Union.
And she was very happy about that. Other people might have been jealous and thought, well, no, I want to just be the last female president. I mean, you're absolutely right. The union did not allow women as members until 1963. Now, we, of course, in the 1970s thought that was ages ago. But in fact, it was only 10 years prior to her arrival at Oxford. And so there had actually only been 2 earlier female presidents, and she was the 3rd and I was the 4th. And in a way that also united us in history, because I was the first woman to follow another woman, because a lot of people said, well, they'll never have another woman after they've had one woman, especially Benazir Bhutto. But she again, it was another aspect of her kindness. She was thrilled and wrote me a wonderful letter of congratulations that I was effectively following in her footsteps.
Now we move to the Pakistan's history. In July 1977, in a coup, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto's democratically elected government was toppled. And at that time, things were very grim, bleak. If we look back at that course of history, that juncture of history, you had a close friendship with Benazir Bhutto, and how this destiny made her politician. From her youthful years of Oxford, she became worried, full of anxieties about the life of her father. And later you also came to Pakistan, and you also wrote a book while covering the appeal of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in the Supreme Court of Pakistan, and on and off you have been with Benazir Bhutto. Can you reflect upon those years?
Well, of course, it was the most incredible transformation from what I'd experienced knowing her in Oxford. And I remember when I came to Pakistan in 1978, really as a result of a letter she'd written. And that was the letter that made me think I must go and show friendship, show support. And she was very keen that she knew I was wanting to embark on a career in journalism, and she was very keen and very worried about the international press not understanding what was actually going on in Pakistan. And again, you have to think back, for this generation, it's impossible to think of not being able to ring someone up on a mobile phone, or not being able to send an email, or not being able to be in touch. But the footprint of media really did sort of stop with the borders of Pakistan. And so that was another of the reasons why I went. I thought I'd be able to write some articles. And you're correct, I did end up writing a book. Initially, I thought I'd just go for a few weeks. But then, as I got caught up in with the lawyers, with what they were doing, what they were working on, the appeal, because by this time, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto had been condemned to death. It was March 18th, 1978, and I'll never forget that day, seeing, as again I've written in my memoir, Bhutto to hang all over the billboards in the United Kingdom. And it was so shocking, and it was one of the reasons why I felt I must, just really for emotional solidarity, go and see her. And that signified my first ever visit to Pakistan.
When you landed in Pakistan in those, it was hot summer, and the only person you knew, she was Benazir Bhutto.
Yes.
And her father was sentenced to death by High Court. And
he was in the jail, and
he
she was already under house arrest.
When you came here, nobody was there to receive except two people in Rawalpindi who somehow they were related to the Pakistan Peace Party. And can you reflect what kind of atmosphere was that, of fear?
Well, it was a great atmosphere of fear. And I think what I really recall from that was firstly the heat which assailed me. I don't think I'd ever been into... I arrived in, I think, early June. It was very, very hot in Rawalpindi. But they felt that, the trial and must be all over the newspapers. And I had to sort of tell them, well, no, it isn't. It's sort of, it's been mentioned, once or twice, but... it was their feeling, and I very quickly picked up on how all-absorbing this trial and appeal was for the average Pakistani citizen. In a way, people's lives in Pakistan were on hold until they knew the outcome. By at that point, the elections had been cancelled. They'd been promised, but they'd been cancelled. Martial law had been declared, and it really did, as I say, within hindsight, it marked a very, very dark and difficult period because, when you have a military dictatorship, and it really was a military dictatorship, you could sense that. There were military on the streets, newspapers. Again, we're talking about newspapers. We're not talking about emails or any other form of social media, but they used to appear with great big columns blacked out in white. And I really, again, looking back, I had no idea what I was getting myself into. But what I did know at the time was that I couldn't just pack up and go home because it was too challenging. I must stay.
You attended the proceedings of appeal in the Supreme Court of Pakistan, and you had the chance to shake hand with the Zulfikar Ali Bhutto Shaheed. And
I did.
And you also made sketches of the judges.
Yes.
What was the atmosphere when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto came to address Supreme Court of Pakistan in his defense?
It was electric. It was absolutely electric. People had been queuing to get into the Supreme Court. Even his supporters from Larkana, and the courtroom was absolutely packed that first day. They'd done a little sort of culling of people because you had to renew your pass. To go into the Supreme Court, you couldn't just walk in. You had to have a pass, and I had a pass. And I think just shortly before that, they withdrew all the passes and said you must renew them. So a lot of people actually didn't get into the Supreme Court. Benazir was by this stage under house arrest and not allowed into the Supreme Court, and she was desperately upset. So I managed to get in, and of course after each day I wrote her notes as to what had happened. But it's true that Mr. Bhutto, he was speaking at the podium. It was very emotional because he'd been kept in solitary confinement, and he'd pleaded that he should be able to speak in his defense. And I'd managed with another journalist to be sitting quite close to the front. And I'd never met him before, in fact, but I had communicated to him through the lawyers because we were at this point, again, as I've mentioned in the memoir, we were working on the rejoinder. Yes, but I was assisting with the typing of the...
In Fleshman Hotel, you were typing...
Yes, the rejoinder, which was
he had a heart attack.
Legal document. That was later. That was after Mr. Bhutto's appearance. But Mr. Bhutto, he then saw me and he turned and shook my hand. And I think it was a gesture of in thanks because he knew that I'd been working very hard with the lawyers by this stage. And the following day, when I came to try and take up the similar position, that position was filled with security people. Nobody could get near.
In the box where Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was speaking.
They couldn't. I was lucky that I was sufficiently close that I was able, that first day he was able to reach out and shake my hand. But after that, they cordoned off. They didn't cordon it off, but they ensured that other people, and they were very clearly security people, were sitting so that nobody could get near even to shake his hand.
That was your first and the final handshake with Zulfikar Ali Bhutto.
And only handshake.
And you have been typing his legal documents.
Yes.
And Benazir Bhutto didn't know the typing, and you knew the typing.
But she learned very fast.
Whatever Bhutto's liars needed to be typed, you both have been typing, and Benazir Bhutto's fingers were bleeding once they got stuck in the keyboard.
Yes, I mean, it's a novel phenomenon.
Very tragic days of our history.
Nobody would understand that now with typing on a laptop.
And the documents were, other than legal documents too, in the defense of the white paper, Bhutto's rebuttal of the white paper.
That was the rejoinder. We called it the rejoinder, yes. Because during that period, again, notwithstanding that the issue was, as we would say, sub judice, the military dictatorship had chosen to issue some white papers. Mr. Bhutto was quite funny about the white papers. He retained his sense of humor because they were being translated into all sorts of other languages, including Arabic. And I remember him writing on one note, what does a Sheikh Prince sort of, how is he interested in, democratic elections? But it was very hard, and it was very hard for Benazir because let's not forget her mother was also under house arrest. So, and so were most of the top political leaders. And again, when you're thinking about her own transformation into a political leader, people wanted news. They wanted someone to report to. And with Mr. Bhutto in jail and the other top leaders either in jail or under house arrest, the people came to her, and that's how she came to be his spokesperson.
Zulfikar Ali Bhutto used to send you notes on small pieces of paper because he was not allowed the stationery or the papers in his jail. Whenever his lawyers, Yahya Bakhtiar and his team would visit him, whatever he had to get typed, he would send it through them, then you and Benazir Bhutto would type.
Yes.
So it must have been a very hectic work because on the small bits of paper and
often
making
he would
something
write
out
on
of that.
the back of the bits of paper that we typed on, because the important thing to stress is that he could have done, but he never did write his memoirs because he insisted on only writing legal documents that related to his defense. And that's why the rejoinder was a legal document answering certain points in the white papers. And that is why, what we were doing coming through the lawyers was perfectly feasible and allowable because it was a legal document. But it was still very, what we would say, amateur sort of reporting because of what we were dealing with. We were dealing with typewriters and handwritten everything he wrote, he started off by writing handwritten. You see, it's also the story of the change of technology. And, often I talk to younger people and they actually just can't imagine it, that you haven't got the wherewithal to, have a laptop.
If I'm assassinated and some other things which are attributed to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, were these things written in the jail and you typed, and Benazir Bhutto typed these things?
Those were the documents that we typed. We typed whatever, and it was one of the reasons was that I actually had learnt to type. I thought it was a fun occupation when I was 11 years old. And that was why it was useful, because I was very fast. And that's why I helped her. But yes, it was really also to take the workload off the lawyers, because they had so much to do. I mean, it was, it was a proper appeal against the death sentence, using common law, using criminal law, using, all the legal books. And you mentioned the tragedy of, while this was still being under review, Ghulam Ali Memon, one of the top criminal lawyers, he literally, through exhaustion and hard work, I was sitting with him, he just said, Allahu Akbar, and then fell to one side on the sofa, and he had a massive heart attack. And I had to write to Benazir and say, one of the top lawyers in the middle, and this was in March, and, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto was...
You see, you have been shifting like nomads during those days. Sometimes when you came first time in Pindi, then Getmel Motel, then Fleshman, then Dr. Zafar Niazi's house.
Yes.
Dr. Zafar Niazi was a committed friend of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and still that family is committed friends of Bhutto's. And then you moved to some Portuguese diplomat's house. So why you have been moving roofs so rapidly?
Well, because it was a very difficult period, and I was, even though, albeit a foreigner, I was very identified with the appeal, and the Niazi family you mentioned, they were absolutely wonderful. They took me in, they took Benazir in, and then she was under house arrest, and I was able to continue to stay there, and it was my real home from home, and it became my home from home. But it was not easy for people to receive me, because the security was there. They would look down at the houses. I remember once meeting I think he was an Austrian diplomat, and he said, oh, well, it would be nice to have a sort of new face at a dinner party, but I don't want my house noted down as being a house that you visited. It was quite, the surveillance was very open, but it was quite effective, because it sort of froze people off. They didn't want to get involved. Only the journalists. I kept obviously very much in touch with the journalists, because they were anxious for news of what I knew what was going on.
Supreme Court decision was split decision, and the opinion of the international jurists at that time was that it is a judicial murder. And recently, President Asif Ali Zardari, in a presidential reference, asked Supreme Court to revisit Bhutto case, and Supreme Court, after years of filing that defense,
46 years,
came up with a verdict that Bhutto was not given a fair trial. What do you say about that?
Well, it's what we knew all along, and it's very tragic. It does not bring back Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. It does not bring back Benazir Bhutto's life as it might have been had her father lived. But I do think it sets, to a degree, the record straight, because we realized that it was a political trial. And even the judgment of the Supreme Court, the verdict was split 4-3. You do not send somebody to their death on a split verdict.
Would have been different if, sorry to disrupt you, if two judges, one would have not retired, other would have not died, and they would have been
it could well have been
on the bench.
We don't know, because as we now know, and I knew this from conversations with Justice Safdar Shah, who came to London subsequently, and I spent a lot of time with him, was that the judges were under a great deal of pressure. And interestingly, the administration, the martial law regime, didn't appear to mind having some, quotes, dissenters, so long as the verdict was a majority verdict. It was the Chief Justice, Anwar al-Haq, who in a way had the deciding vote. And so maybe other judges would have been subjected to even more pressure. One likes to think that they would have withstood it. But on a legal basis, yes. I mean, those two judges, we don't know, but it did appear that they were disbelieving the prosecution's case. And certainly that would have made it difficult for the military regime had the verdict been, say, 5-4 but as I say, it was highly irregular to retire a judge, Justice Salim, when you're in the middle of hearing. You've already constituted the bench. But we were so powerless in those days. It's hard to imagine.
That was the darkest period of Pakistan's history, and you were denied the entry to the Supreme Court when the verdict was to be announced.
This was another sort of trick of the regime. When the verdict was announced, they then withdrew all the passes and reissued other passes. And I think I didn't know, or I hadn't been informed, or hadn't realized, and they said, no, your pass is not valid. And so I remember being very distressed. Of course, I knew pretty quickly what the verdict, what the announcement was. But yes, I mean, there were all these sort of tricks that were being played to sort of destabilize you during that period. But nothing, as I say, for me, I was a bystander watching. Nothing as traumatic as what Benazir experienced, and indeed her sister and brothers abroad. They were not able to come back and see their father. And one has to bear that in mind. The mother was under house arrest as well. It was such a traumatic time.
They kept them under house arrest sometimes in different cities, sometimes in different jails, sometimes different places, while in the same city.
Before the verdict, they moved them from a house where they were in Islamabad to, I'm not sure what it was, I think it was a police camp, but it was in Sahala. It was a ways out. It was difficult to get to. I did manage to get permission to see Benazir on 2 or 3 occasions then. It was always a hefty business trying to get permission. I have to write to the Home Secretary in Lahore and not have my letters answered. And I remember one sort of time when I received a permission, and I was so excited, and I looked on the permission slip, again, a typed out piece of paper, and it said, you have been granted permission to visit Miss Benazir Bhutto. And then I thought, well, there's no date. What day am I allowed to have permission? So I immediately got on the telephone to ring up the Home Secretary, which was of itself a challenge. And when I finally got through to him, he said, oh no, date's over, cancelled, reapply. It was those sort of things that were just undermining.
You have described your last meeting with Benazir Bhutto after the verdict and before the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. It's very painful to read. Tears well down once one is reading those lines. You have been great source of emotional strength for Benazir Bhutto, being her friend, and in those difficult days, being on her side. You have been meeting her and staying with her whenever the government allowed you to stay with them in Karachi, in Al-Murtaza, Ladkana, and not in Islamabad or Rawalpindi, but only in Karachi and Ladkana. How do you recall the determination of Benazir Bhutto in those days?
Well, it was extraordinary because, during that period, and we're talking about the 1980s, and I myself returned home, but, as we know, that she was kept under arrest for a period of time. Then she was released, and then she was rearrested and kept virtually out of circulation for nearly 5 years during the early 80s. But she was just extraordinary with her bravery, that she would come out. I mean, I've called it, and I've actually called the chapter, her street fighting years, because she was not cowed. She wasn't saying, oh dear, this is too much for me, I can't manage this. She took on the military dictatorship, and it was quite extraordinary. I was watching we had the news feeds coming in over the BBC, and I was working the BBC at the time, and these fiery statements came out that she would not compromise, and huge courage for a woman who was still only in her late 20s, early 30s.
You also wrote a book, Bhutto, Trial and Execution. and its Urdu translation, Sindhi translation was also made. And those were your experiences of Bhutto's trial. How did you witness that, and how the people were in that grief, that sorrow, how Bhutto family and the Peace Party and its workers were going through that sorrow. But afterwards, there comes again interval, some relief for Benazir Bhutto when she wins the election after years of jail, after years of exile, which I don't want to go into detail because otherwise we'll be keep on talking. And when she became the Prime Minister, what kind of euphoria you witnessed? Because after almost 11 years exile and that tragedy of execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, and then the loss of her dearest brother Shah Nawaz, when she became the Prime Minister of Pakistan for the first time, and she made a history. She was the female Prime Minister, Lady Prime Minister of Pakistan. So what kind of atmosphere was that, and what kind of euphoria you saw on the streets of Pakistan or in the world media?
Well, it was extraordinary. It was absolutely wonderful. It was December 1988. She'd, of course, recently given birth to her son, and she'd married the previous December. I had come to the wedding, and it was just wonderful. And I think the turning point that I witnessed most was she held a conference 10 years after her father's execution, and she invited a lot of the lawyers who'd already come, and Yahya Bakhtiar came, and so did Ramsey Clark, who'd come to attend the proceedings for a while, former US Attorney General. And we went back to Larkana literally 10 years to the day of her father's execution. And I remember sitting with her on the steps of Larkana in the early morning before she had to get on with her duties. And, you know, we just somehow felt, well, all that pain was sort of set to rest. And this was the beginning of a new phase. And, you know, I genuinely believed that. And it was so wonderful. There she was, this, you know, extraordinary Prime Minister. Her stakes were so high, you know, not just within Pakistan, but also in the international community. And you sort of thought, well, it's been a painful journey, but it's worked out in the end. But of course, as we know, during her 2 administrations, she had a very challenging time. Neither administration was she able to complete to full term. And I think, again, I've spoken now to people who really regret the opposition, even among the media. They didn't give her a chance. They were criticizing it. I remember speaking to someone at the time saying, you know, if you take over as CEO of a company, you're given, you know, at least 4 or 5 years to sort of get it ship shape again. Because this is the point about the 11 years of military dictatorship. Everything was put on hold. The proper functioning of a parliamentary system had not been functioning. And so therefore, you know, she
the
actually
Constitution
said to
was
me,
abrogated.
yes, exactly. You see,
Judiciary was under
it was
duress.
just very difficult. I mean, her terms to me were, you know, I entered an empty office literally and figuratively. And that was how she had to begin. So she was not really given a chance. And as I say, I know people now, I mean, even just recently, I was sitting with some journalists who said, we wish we'd given her more of a chance in the media, because as you know, the media is very powerful. And if the media starts sort of reporting failure and not doing any very well, and et cetera, then, you know, it snowballs.
You have been corresponding with Benazir Bhutto, and both of you have been writing all these years till the invention of computers and
Yes.
emails. Before that, you have been writing letters. And there must be a big archive at your place and at Benazir Bhutto's place of those letters. That correspondence must be worth reading for the future historians.
Well, I was lucky that I had kept it. I mean, as a journalist, I'm very keen on primary sources. And so when I wrote my memoir, which I finally decided after 13 years following her assassination that I would do so, and I've done it for her children and for my children and for future generations of Pakistanis. I wanted them to understand how you can have a deep friendship across continents, across religions, across cultures, and how...
You have profusely quoted those letters in your memoir.
Yes, I was able to quote the letters. I was able to quote the letters that my mother had saved that I'd written back home. After 40 years, I found them. My mother's since passed. But I was able to use those letters. And it's very important to have primary sources because the memory, it changes, it fades. You maybe think of things differently. But I was very keen when I wrote the memoir that it should be authentic.
How do you see her role as opposition leader vis-a-vis as a Prime Minister of Pakistan?
Well, I think she was a very powerful opposition leader as well. I think she gave as good as she got
Indeed, she
in
was.
a way. But I think the breakdown of the system was why she went into exile. And she spent 8 years in exile, first living in England and then she shifted to Dubai. Ultimately, it was just tragic. And I think one can never really forget that the price she paid for her commitment to her country. And I say that as an outsider, but as an outsider who's witnessed it and thanks to her got to know and understand the country very well. I think it's true to say that, it's beginning to be almost 50 years since I first came to Pakistan. When we get to 2028, it will be 50 years. And I've spent a lot of time understanding Pakistan. And I think the tragedy for her was that in a way she was held back from the commitment that she wanted to do. And when she went back to try and contest to become Prime Minister for the third time, that October 2007, I remember her turning to me and saying, I just want to achieve something. She did achieve a lot, but she always underestimated what she achieved. She achieved a lot just by being a woman, being a Prime Minister. But there was more she wanted to do. She was only 54 years old. And now, again, looking back, we're getting on to 18 years.
In Pakistan,
it was very young.
We recognize that we would not find any leaders like Bhutto's, like in Benazir Bhutto's or Fakhar Bhutto. But how do you see this standing broad in the international community?
Well, she had huge standing, and I think the thing about her was partly because of her education. She understood the West as well. She was very much of her own culture. It was her father who actually talked about his sort of Eastern soul and Western sort of ideas, and she was very similar to that.
You see, in Pakistan, in her achievements, there's the women's rights, emancipation of women, and poverty alleviation, and also the freedom of expression, and the restoration of the Constitution of 1973, which was mercilessly amended by Ziaul Haq. How do you see these achievements and regional stability and peace?
Well, again, I think one has to put it in context of she wanted to achieve so much more. I mean, one should not ever denigrate her achievements, but she was hampered in achieving more. I mean, even small things like, I mentioned this the other day to some people. She pioneered police women, so that if a woman is arrested, she's not interrogated by a man, she's interrogated by a woman. Small things like that. I mean, even her focus, she identified how important the internet was going to be. That was one of the things that she brought into Pakistan. Because she realized that this is going to be...
She was the face of Pakistan.
Revolutionary.
Progressive Pakistan.
Yes.
When she would speak at foreign forums, at lecturing circuits of the world, or she spoke once to the US Parliament, the both houses, the Congress and the Senate.
That was fantastic.
And all senators and the congressmen, they gave her the standing ovation.
No, that was fantastic. That was during her first term of office. No, and she met the Queen. She came on a state visit to the UK. She traveled the world, and she was a breath of fresh air. I mean, people were fascinated. But you say internationally, I don't think internationally that people really understood the significance of what she'd done, becoming Prime Minister of a Muslim nation. In a way, I felt very much people thought, well, you know, we've had Margaret Thatcher, which for us was unusual. We had a prime minister, our first prime minister, British, a female prime minister, and then no one now Pakistan's got a female prime minister. But nobody really, unless you understand the country and the culture, appreciated what a huge change that was, and a huge step forward, lifting the glass ceiling for women throughout Pakistan, whether they were going into politics, whether they were journalists, whether they were doctors or lawyers. And I spoke to many in those different professions. One of the programs I made was Women in Pakistan for the BBC Radio World Service. And it starts off with a quote from her. I do consider myself a role model. And she was. But then I interviewed other people. And they all said, you know, she might not be able to do everything. You know, she's prime minister. She's got, you know, the restraints. But behind her, we can operate. We can move forward. You know, we as lawyers, as journalists, as doctors. And that's her lasting contribution, which nobody can ever take away.
So when she was in power and Prime Minister of Pakistan twice, do you think that she had the same belief in the institution of friendship when she was not Prime Minister?
She definitely always valued friendship. She valued and she loved her friends. I mean, I was very fortunate, and partly because I made a lot of my journalistic career in Pakistan. But she retained many friends, and one of the things we used to do, when she was coming on a visit, she'd say, "Oh, let's see so and so, let's see so and so," and then, you know, I'd sometimes, if I'd been here, someone had got married, or she'd be sending me back with a wedding present. She drew strength from friendship. I mean, you know, yes. Obviously she had her mother still for a long period of her life, but she lost,
she always made a point. Once she was on official visits to UK, and she would visit your place, and she would request that gather all friends, yes, that I want to meet there. What golden days were of her life and your friendship with her?
She loved, as I say, going back to a point I made initially, how appreciative she was. She appreciated those friendships. She appreciated the interest. As I say, some of those friends managed to visit Pakistan as well, but others didn't. But they'd retained an interest and an affection for her, and I think she drew strength from that. Certainly, during the dark days, she drew strength. And we would sit, when I was allowed the meetings with her, and she'd say, well, wonder what so-and-so's doing. And then we'd sort of reminisce on this and reminisce on that. And that stayed even during her busy life. And, you know, we all know if you're an important person and you're in politics and you're a celebrity, or, you know, you're in the public eye, you want to be able to relax, and you want to be able to be with people who have no agenda, who just love you for who you are. And that's what she felt with her friends and her UK friends and her American friends.
In 2007, when Benazir Bhutto returned from exile and you accompanied her, you joined her in Dubai, and you were in that caravan, on that truck on the roof with Benazir Bhutto, when that, in the middle of night, that procession, which had a crowds of millions of people, the way they had welcomed her in 1986 after her exile, and people were happy, hopeful that Pakistan's destiny will change with the return. And then she was attacked by terrorists, and you were on that scene. Do you think that terrorist attack, in which so many precious lives were lost, deterred her from a struggle for democracy?
Deterred her?
Deterred her? It created any obstacle for her? Deterred her?
No. It actually reinforced that she didn't. Of course, it was shocking. It was not what she wanted, but certainly she intended to carry on. And of course, it's one of the tragedies. And what we always say is that we don't know how many other attempts there were on her life, which might have failed between the October period and the December period. I think what that attack did was, I mean, she realized in in the sort of the abstract how dangerous it was, and people had warned her, but that attack demonstrated to her that this was very serious. It was a very serious situation, but never once did she say, "I'm just packing it in and I'm not going to carry on." I've talked to her before she left, even when she was in London during the summer, and she said it to others as well. She said, life and death are in God's hands. And she believed that. And she prepared for the worst, but she hoped for the best. She obviously wanted to live.
Many people at that time have been warning her that you should live to fight for another day. Many friends abroad in Pakistan, they wished that in this kind of scenario where her life is threatened. So, did you give similar advice, or you recall those days? What conversation
Well, no,
you had with her?
I remember those days very clearly, partly because it's among the last interactions I ever had with her. But I think, she was determined, and she was fully aware of the dangers. It wasn't for anybody to put pressure on her not to do what she wanted to do. As we know, she was very determined. I think she'd thought of going back in 2002 and hadn't for those elections. And so for her, it was very important to go back for the 2007 elections. I think she felt she'd been long enough out, and the party needed her leadership and needed her direction. And as I say, you have to go forward believing in what you want to do, and it was a very dangerous time, but she was not prepared to say, well, it's too dangerous, I'm not coming back, because so many other people were putting their lives at risk. So many people put their lives at risk and were killed on that 1st October bomb blast. Over 150 people, the biggest terrorist attack apart from the Peshawar Academy, I believe, in Pakistan. And that was Benazir Bhutto in her 50s. She'd matured, she was committed, she still felt she had a contribution to make, which she did. I mean, I felt she was like this sort of, oak tree that was felled. And that was the loss. She'd become a mature politician, and
She was now more mature politician. She
was young when she was first prime minister. But that was, of course, what they intended. They intended, to take her down. And it remains, I think one of the saddest things for me was, I was in the BBC studios the night of her assassination, doing a lot of interviews, and it flashed up, the wonderful photograph with 1953 to 2007. And it's such a sudden final change. You have your birth date, and her birth date, I knew off by heart, obviously it was 1953, and then suddenly to see it joined to the date of her death indicates the finality, that was the end of her life, and that we would never know. We could suggest, write, think, sort of suppose what might have happened, but there was to be no more chapter of her life. And I think, as a friend, that's what I felt robbed of. And I'm sure, millions of Pakistanis, they felt robbed of that. They felt robbed of knowing what more contribution she could make, not only in Pakistan, but on the world stage, because she had that world stature. She was a force of nature. She would turn heads. She would walk into the room, and, you might be chatting to someone, but suddenly she was one of those rare women. And
you see the many women leaders of the world, Theresa May, of Prime Minister of Britain, and the New Zealand's women Prime Minister, they have been paying rich tributes to Benazir Bhutto years after years. So that legacy of Benazir Bhutto at international level and domestically, what future you see after Benazir Bhutto?
Well, as we know, her family has come together, and I'm not sure she would have wished it. She certainly would not have wished it at such a young age. Her son took over as chairman of the Pakistan People's Party. her younger daughter, Asifa, is now also a member of the National Assembly. That, in a way, is part and parcel of having a premature removal from the scene. And I remember once being asked to speak on dynasty at one of the Karachi literature festivals I'd attended, and it's not an easy subject to speak on dynasty because people don't like to think of political dynasties, but there are political dynasties not just in Pakistan, but in India, in America, and all over the world. Like there are banking dynasties, there are acting dynasties. You become an actor because your parents have become an actor. We're actors, and Benazir, she did step into take up her father's political mantle and subsequently made her own persona as a politician. And Bilawal is doing the same thing and picking up the mantle and making his own persona. But I remember at this talk, I said, if you don't want to have political dynasties, stop assassinating your leaders. Because that's why both Benazir and her son Bilawal took up politics at the point of time they did. They might have done so later, they might have done so at any other time. But as you see, it creates a duty, an obligation to finish the mission, to carry on with the mission. Benazir was carrying on with her father's mission, Bilawal is carrying on with his mother's mission.
Two former presidents of Oxford Student Union went to Oxford for the admission of Bilawal Bhutto Zardari.
Yes.
And since that,
to join the Oxford Union.
Many years have passed, and now Bilawal is a matured politician. How do you see his political future?
Well, I see, there's change and change again. And I think the whole world is going through quite a reactionary phase politically, but the space will come for progressive, liberal politics, and those are the politics which the PPP and chaired by Bilawal espouse. And I think we will see a change. I won't say that we're in that change right now, because I think we have to be serious about what's going on in the entire world, including the United Kingdom. But I am an optimist. I remain optimistic, and notwithstanding all the setbacks, I remain optimistic. If you retain your integrity and you retain your values, ultimately you will reach the platform and reach the fulfillment of your aspirations that you were destined to do.
The last question, that's about your memoir. How it is received abroad in Pakistan, and is it all said and done, or do you intend to write something further on this chapter of our Pakistani history?
Well, I think the memoir is all said and done because it ends with her assassination. And to me, that was obviously the end of our friendship. As I say, I thought it was very important to do, and I demurred because a lot of people said after her assassination, oh, you were a friend, you should capitalize on her death and write a memoir. And I said, no, I mean, that's not why you write a memoir. But it was very much because I did want to record.
Tell her story.
Future generations and tell her story as I had witnessed it. Of course, there's a lot more about her life. She did a lot of other foreign trips I didn't know about. I mean, there was she's written her own memoir. But I still maintain, and for everything that's going on in the world, that is of interest, that you can create a friendship at university and you can continue with it throughout life, through all the ups and downs. And it's enriching. It certainly enriched my life. And I have a lot of people, and they say, oh, you write on Pakistan. Was your father in the
You have not only
army?
written on Pakistan Peace Party, you have written on so many other scholarly subjects like Kashmir, like
yes.
Afghanistan,
Well,
like
it brought
Dewan,
me, I mean, the friendship.
like the ladies, women
Yes.
who
Yes.
played a vital role in the Second World War
Yes.
in the Navy.
that is true. The friendship brought me to writing on Kashmir, which is an issue very close to my heart, which was very close to her heart. But as I say, I think a lot of the times people get worried because their lives aren't programmed and they don't quite know what direction they're going to go. But it's very much as she said, I didn't choose this life, it chose me. And in a way, I didn't choose Pakistan, it chose me through the friendship. And it's very enriching. And when I do talk to students, which I sometimes am requested to do about, careers in media or careers in journalism or, future prospects, and I say, everybody's worried about what subject they're studying at university, as though that subject has to be what will dictate their future career. But I always say you never know who you might meet. You're going amidst a body of other people who might determine your life. And certainly that was the case with me. I knew I wanted to be a writer. I knew I wanted to go into journalism. But I didn't know that I would become, so to speak, a South Asia expert, as people like to say.
Benazir had a role in that.
But she had the huge role. And she was, we are finishing up now, but she was always very excited about it. You see, this was the other thing. She was thrilled. I remember when my book on Kashmir, I think she'd been to Harvard, and she said, "Oh, I've seen your book piled up in the bookshop in Harvard." She loved other people's successes. And I think this is a characteristic of her which people don't know about. The way she promoted other women, the women who are in politics now in Pakistan, she promoted them, she identified them and wanted them, to succeed. And same in other professions. And so while she is missed physically, I think the legacy is still there. And again, there's another reason why I think people should know about her.
It will live on.
And it will live on, it will live on through what she said and what she's experienced. And it's a very moving experience, and it's a very moving life.
Thank you very much, distinguished writer, author, the friend of Mohtarama Benazir Bhutto Shaheed, and that friendship's legend, that saga has been well narrated, passionately narrated in this book, this memoir, The Fragrance of Tears. So, dear listeners, dear viewers, if you have the opportunity to be in any library, in any bookshop, don't miss this book. Thank you very much, Victoria Schofield, for being in our studios and talking about Benazir Bhutto Shaheed, your friendship with her, and the trial and the execution of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto Shaheed, and all those turbulent years of Pakistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
ये रेडियो पाकिस्तान पॉडकास्ट है।